Richard, we don't see in the Bible like formal structures of theology, formal theological statements. How do we justify saying that we should build these kinds of theologies? Shouldn't we just read the Bible and then use that as our theology?
Yeah, that's great. Good. That is a hard question because you do get the impression, especially from the New Testament, that the kind of theologizing, talk about God that they were doing doesn't really match up with what we tend to do today as Christians. I mean, let's just sort of face it. It looks like a different sort of thing. There are two things I would say about that. One is that what we have in the New Testament is not formal theology because the New Testament is, as it were, written out of the formal theology that the apostles and other New Testament writers believed. These are letters, for example. The Pauline epistles are letters addressing practical issues in the lives of those people, but they address the practical issues of those people's lives out of a system or systems, a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world that the Apostle Paul had in his heart. Now, he never sat down and wrote the philosophy of the Apostle Paul. And in fact, people want to argue that the book of Romans is that, but it's not. Okay, the book of Romans is very much oriented toward the conflicts between the Jews and Gentiles in the church at Rome. And if you think about how those chapters lay out, that you can see almost everything is about Jewish and Gentile controversy. And so even that is very pastoral. But what we do in Christian theology is we take these letters, these pastoral letters, and even the Gospels are in many respects pastoral, and Jesus' own personal ministry was pastoral. We take that material and we try to reconstruct, as it were, what was underneath it, what was behind it. What makes sense out of these sort of pieces sticking up out of the surface of the water or the tips of the iceberg that we find in the New Testament? What makes sense of that underneath? And that's what formal theology is sort of piecing together all these different pastoral things. It would be like my sermons, and when I preach, I don't preach theology in a formal sense. I'm trying to preach and even teach. I'm trying to teach to the needs of the people that are out there, as good pastors would try to do always. But back inside of me is a sort of frame of reference, a way of looking at life and a way of looking at theology that informs those applications. And sometimes unfortunately, in formal academic theology, all we ever do is try to talk about what's under the surface. What's that frame of reference? What's that format out of which we speak in pastoral ways? And that's where I think the disconnect happens, is that people don't see the almost immediate connection between the more formal and the more practical, the more informal, as it were, because everybody does theology to one degree or another. And everybody has even a sort of set of beliefs, and all we're doing in formal theology is speaking to that set of beliefs and trying to refine that and mature that as much as possible.
So as we try to read the Bible and formulate our theology, it seems like it would take a lot of wisdom to do something like this.
It takes a lot, I mean, a huge amount, because you have to take not just the New Testament, which is all these pastoral tips of the iceberg sticking up out of the water, but you also take all the variety that's in the Old Testament too and bring that in as well. And in addition to that, as we say in this lesson, in fact, you have to bring general revelation, the revelation of God in all things, into play as well. So yes, creating a formal theology is very complicated, and that's why we have to talk about it to some degree. David, have you ever seen people that become so formal and so academic in their theology that they don't bring it up to the surface?
Or they don't admit it. They don't.
Okay.
They don't think that they have any kind of formal theology.
Yeah, that's good.
They sort of deny it almost, but you can tell by the way they talk and the way they act that they do have a very formal theology.
Right.
And so they almost kind of betray their own person.
Yeah, maybe they haven't learned it in a school, and in that sense it's not formal. But they've got a way of looking at life. They have a world and life view, we say often. Okay, they do. And that's the reality that we're talking about. That's what we mean by more formal theology. And hopefully, by giving attention to that, you actually do it better. Now, that doesn't always work. Sometimes you do it worse when you give attention to it. But if you can think of it like a computer, I think of formal theology, or the sort of undergirding theology is down here, as sort of the default drive to which people drop when they're not being forced into answering a particular kind of question or think in a particular way by some software. It's just sort of where they naturally go back to. My grandmother, who was a Christian but not very well educated in Christianity, she had a very developed theological posture about all kinds of things, and it worked for her. I mean, she had a system by which she thought about things. Now, some of the things she thought were wacky, but nevertheless, she thought them. And every time a question would come up, she would drop down to that default. I mean, that was what she believed. That was her bottom line. It was a system of beliefs that she had. And so in formal theology, we do things like come up with words, jargon, that hopefully clarify things and help us do it in better ways. We interact with other people who have done this through the centuries so we can do it in better ways. We go back to the Bible in more academic ways so that we can create a better system, a more formalized and reflective system. But it's something that everybody does. It's not something that is utterly different even from the New Testament, because the writers of the New Testament had their theological belief system as well. And that's what we're trying to uncover, that kind of thing in formal theology.